So, just a few things to think about here at the end. Ohe has proposed a very interesting dynamic in terms of human freedom, and that dynamic is between the not opposing at all, actually, the complementary forces, one might say, of biological nature and of culture in the human being. But what exactly are these different forces realized in the human being? A little ambiguous, I think, here in terms of looking at this opposition in terms of our emotions as opposed to looking at this opposition in terms of our intellect. He seems to suggest that there's a fairly distinct process here. The whole idea of opposing pleasure and pain to joy and sorrow seems to appeal to our emotional side. That is, a civilized person feels joy and sorrow, not just pleasure and pain. Joy and sorrow being emotions. So the idea here is that culture does affect our emotions. It enables us to feel a wider range of emotions and enables us, therefore, to a wider sphere of action. On the other hand, uh, you know, and the idea is that the cultural emotions, we might say, of joy and sorrow, also restrict us as human beings in terms of limiting us to some extent. On the other hand, he thinks of this in an intellectual way. That is, that we think intellectually with the categories that we culturally acquire, especially through the learning of language, and that these, on this intellectual side, the acquisition of culture can also, although it enriches our lives, can also restrict us in terms of thinking. Uh, and how do we expand the framework intellectually and emotionally, I suppose, what he's ultimately interested in. Well, that's a little bit mysterious, exactly what he's getting at. But page 317, the third section, let's just look at the whole last paragraph in the first column. The first move of human existence from the state of nature to the state of culture means, in the phraseology of our section 2 pronouncement, that culture frees man from nature. Initial movement, the way that culture expands our horizons. But cultural creation, in the course of time, inevitably becomes institutionalized and restrictive of freedom. And a return move from culture to nature in one form or another must take place. So, nature is the force, the liberating force that can break the bonds of a calcified or too rigid structure of culture. Which means, in our phraseology, nature frees man from culture. This return move from culture to nature, however, must tend to culture again, making a leap to a new, higher state of culture. That is, he doesn't see nature as being destructive of culture, but rather nature as being a way to change culture, to innovate in, in culture. It says, but with the sound cultural development, the movement will go on and on, repeating the moves and the return moves one after another, as it were, in a slowly ascending spiral movement toward greater realization of human freedom. What could be more Kantian than that? That's really interesting. Sort of like, in a way, just redescribing Kant's notion of enlightenment, or process of enlightenment. This slowly ascending spiral movement, back and forth between nature and culture, but ultimately going up. Ultimately going up. It's very Kantian, isn't it? Yes, it is. So, I don't know if this is recording or not. Sorry, I got distracted there. So he ends this by saying, page 318, to be sure, man's freedom is not great, but without this bit of freedom there is no life worthy of man. Fortunately, the history of human development tells us how many and how great are the things this little freedom has done, and it also shows us how to enlarge this freedom of ours, where we are constantly searching for ways to expand our freedom. And we know that culture liberates us from nature. It makes us more free, but we also know that culture necessarily, because it sets limits, confines our horizons of thinking and feeling and acting. And through innovation in the arts, science, philosophy, religion, and all sorts of things, that we have the ability to change culture. Ohe, like Kant, has this faith that we can expand human freedom by constantly innovating in culture, constantly changing culture. Very interesting.